If you grew up in Wisconsin, you're probably familiar with this jingle. The hardest working people in America find value at Farm and Fleet. Founded in 1955 by brothers William Claude Blain and Norbert Albert Burt Blain, Janesville-based Blain's Farm and Fleet is an iconic Wisconsin retailer that now has 45 stores in Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Michigan, and 5,500 employees. The business today is owned by Jane Blain Gilbertson, Burt Blain's daughter. After leading the company for 10 years as CEO, she stepped down from that role last year, but remains involved as executive chairman. We're excited to have Jane here today to talk about her family business journey and multiple transitions with Farm and Fleet. Please welcome Jane. Let's dive into this journey. Obviously, you grew up in the Farm and Fleet business, in the family business. As a teenager, you worked at the stores, but let's start off with you. You headed to college, and you weren't initially sure you were going to join the family business. What were you thinking as you headed off to college, the direction you were going to take?
Yeah. So I went up to Miami of Ohio and was a business major. I guess I'm a slow learner. It took me about halfway through my junior year to decide I actually wanted to be a retail major. I remember coming back telling my folks that I would need to take some additional classes and do an extra semester, and I'm sure they were like, it just occurred to you now that you're gonna be a retail major. So I wanted to be retail, but honestly did not want to come back to the family business. I felt retail at that point was big department store retail, and I felt like I needed to go do my own thing and prove myself. And so kind of a funny story, when I finally was brave enough to tell my folks that I didn't want to come back to the family business as they had planned. My brother before me was already back in the business. My dad was disappointed, as you might imagine. But it was my mom who said, go, because you can always come back. And then my dad reluctantly said, go, because when you come back, you'll have all this additional value. And I'm like, Dad, you're not listening. I'm not coming back. So anyways, I went to work for Macy's and got my big department store experience, but also learned a lot that I didn't intend to learn.
Yeah, well, let's talk more about that. How was the culture at Macy's different from the culture you experienced within your family's business?
Yeah, really couldn't be more different. So, I credit them, and I really am very thankful that they took an opportunity or gave me the opportunity to work with them. Wonderful training program. They had a great executive training program that they were known for at the day. So I really do appreciate that. So how to do the job, which was learn how to be a buyer, learn how to be a merchant. I think they did a terrific job training us to do that. But when it came to the culture piece, that's where I found things were very different than the way I grew up. Now, I was naive, right? 22 years old, thought I had it all figured out. But I didn't understand the way they chose to do business, decisions that they made, that in many cases felt unethical to me. Examples. As a buyer or an assistant buyer, you were told to go back and charge back your vendors when they had messed up on shipping or done something inappropriate, but you were also supposed to do it often when they had done nothing wrong. And that was very hard for me to understand, particularly when they were small vendors that had been really great to deal with, and I knew they were upstart businesses, and I knew that a $50,000 chargeback in those days would have probably put them under. So it was things like that I just didn't understand. I thought you don't need to do business this way because it's not the way that I had been raised. So when I was first told to do that in the one circumstance, I didn't do it. And I thought, this is the day I'm going to call my parents and say I got fired. But luckily, my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss were very ticked off that I hadn't done this. But they understood, I think, why I hadn't done it, because I objected. And luckily, I didn't get fired. They didn't ask me to do it again. But it was things like that. I just saw how they treated their associates, how they treated their vendors, obviously, and it was just very different than the way that I had been taught, where my dad and my uncle really valued relationships, long-term relationships with their vendors. They kept each other honest, right? You screw up, we're going to call you out. We screw up, you call us out. We put our heads together, we find the answer, we move on because we want to build a business together. But it really was very much a, what have you done for me lately kind of atmosphere. So again, I recognize I was very naive, That was probably what a lot of the world was like back then, but I knew there was another way to do business, and it didn't feel right to me.
So your role at Macy's was you were a buyer.
Yeah.
And so what brought you eventually back to the family business?
Yep. Couple different things. I had been there about 9 months, and my mom passed away very unexpectedly at 54, which now I realize how young that was. So there was pressure, particularly from my uncle, come back. Now's the time you need to come back and take care of your dad. My dad didn't
Was
need
your
to
mom
take
involved
care
in
of
the
him.
business?
She was involved in the business at that time. So she was a giftware buyer for the company. But at that time, immediately, like in September when this happened, I still wasn't ready to come back. And then Macy's was going through a consolidation. And I still was going to get my promotion and all of that, but it just felt like the company was shifting and changing rather quickly, maybe not for the best. And between that and my personal family situation, decided a few months later it was time for me to come back. I came back as a children's wear buyer, which I was very excited about. And then my dad, who was the best negotiator of all times, then said, by the way, there's nothing on order since your mom passed away. Can you be the giftware buyer too? I wasn't smart enough or whatever to ask for more money. I just had 2 jobs then. But that's how I ended up being buyer for the organization in 2 different categories. And they were wonderful categories to actually get my feet wet in.
Okay, so and what year did you come back to the family business?
So I came back in '85.
Okay, and so I know a few years after that, major transition started to happen because your uncle passed away in '88.
Yes.
And your father in '93.
Yes.
Walk us through that, what happened when that occurred with the family and with the business.
Yeah. So on my uncle's side, he had 2 daughters. They were not in the business, but their husbands were. And each of those couples had 2 children, 2 daughters, 2 sons. And so by the time I came back, my cousins' husbands were in the business. They'd been in for a long time. And also one of my cousins, second cousins, was in the business before I got there. So when my uncle passed away, we all just figured out how to go forward. My dad was running the business. I should say not a lot changed in the business at that time. My uncle was 88 when he passed away, but he still was working because that's what he did, right? That's what those guys did. Mm. And then a few years later when my father passed away, that was a whole different story. He was very much the center of the organization. We had, and the main story you need to hear here is no succession plan. My dad was an incredibly smart guy. Every day I realized how smart he was, right, as I'm in this business. Had very thorough estate planning, but no succession planning. And so to the outside world, no one knew that. But you can imagine we're planning the funeral and we're going to our attorney's office to try to figure out, as he brokered the deal amongst the various family members who were in the business, who was going to run the business and who was going to do what. So literally came up with one from this family does this, one from this family does, and they were all our areas of expertise. And we walked out locked in arms, and luckily everybody at that time was focused on do what's right for the business. It might not have gone that way. It could have been disastrous, but honestly, none of our people knew that wasn't the plan all along. But it was a really difficult time, as you can imagine, grieving, and then trying to figure out how are we running the company without a previous plan. So that impacted my decision years later greatly about I'm never going to leave my family and our business in that position. So it was great, and I do appreciate that the whole family, while we had differences, at that time stepped forward together and said, we're going to do what's right for the business. So that lasted for a number of years before another transition.
Yeah, so about 5 years later, what happened then? Your uncle's family basically wanted out, correct?
Yep.
How'd you handle that?
So they approached my brother and I, this is after my father had passed away, and said, actually through our attorney, our mutual attorney, and said, we'd like to sell the company or we'd like to take it public. And my brother and I said, we're not interested in either of those things, but if we can come to agreement, maybe we can buy you out. So we went through a 6 months, very fast valuation. And the Pricewaterhouse people in the crowd will remember what that was like. And put a value on it, but at the end of the day, you're still sitting in a room deciding, what's the number. So luckily we came into agreement, and my brother and I bought out the whole rest of the family. So then it was just my brother and I that owned the business.
And what was the reason that they wanted to get out?
Various reasons. As I mentioned, the older generation, they were ready to retire, honestly, so it made sense for them. And I would say the younger generation, some were in the business, some were not in the business. I would say overall, the feeling was we were being sort of surrounded now by Walmarts and big box competitors that hadn't been in our market, and they really didn't think we could compete, and they were very concerned about that. My brother and I felt differently. We thought, we're differentiated enough, we think we can compete. And they just, for various reasons, they weren't interested in the business. They wanted to do other things with the cash, and others who were just really concerned that we couldn't compete. So they all had their own reasons. Luckily, my brother and I were very focused on what we wanted to do with the business. We wanted to grow the business. We worked very well together, and luckily came to agreement, and we bought them out.
So what were the roles? How did you divide the roles between you and your brother then?
At that point, I said I got to take the fun stuff. That's how I look at it. I was a merchant, so I had the buying group, I had marketing, I had store operations. My brother had HR, had finance, and a few other pieces of the operations business. So sort of naturally where we had already worked in the business, and we'd worked with a lot of those leaders through the years already. So they responded really well. I guess it makes sense. They were happy the business was going forward, but they were tremendous support to Robert and I as we were making that transition. And it was a lot of fun, honestly. We worked our tails off, but we were very passionate about what we thought we could do and had good support. But it was the first time we went to a bank and asked for a whole bunch of money at once. That was an interesting process, but luckily we paid that loan off early, and the business continued to grow.
And how did you grow the business as you mentioned, the retail environment became increasingly competitive, increasingly challenging? How'd you do it?
I think we took lessons from, in particular, my father, who was really good at being clear about how we needed to differentiate ourselves. So when Walmart came to town, it's a classic example, they built one of their new vendor stores right across from our hometown store in Janesville. And they told us they were sending a message, and I hear lots of great stories about Sam Walton. I'm going to tell you just my own personal experience. Walking up to my father in our store, kind of pointing at his chest saying, "You're done, I'm coming for you." Sam Walton, who was giant, right? And my dad didn't take that very well. It was probably just what he needed to hear, though, because it was like, all right, let's be serious, right? Game on. So he did a lot of things at the time to differentiate. They brought in work boots, but they weren't well-made work boots. Ours were. So he had people cut up work boots in half and put them on posters in our stores and showed them theirs and ours, and is this what you want to work in it all day long? I mean, I love those kinds of stories. So those were kind of examples of how he helped us think about, maybe not that directly, but let's be really thoughtful about how do we differentiate, how we are different, the kind of quality brands that we bring, the amazing people with so much longevity in our business. And we just really, for the first time, started to talk about those things. We weren't very good about talking about ourselves. It wasn't a humble thing to do. But we realized we needed to start to let people know that there was a difference. And I think it paid off. It resonated with people. And again, we kept amazing people with such great knowledge. In a lot of cases, they didn't have those types of people, that made those kind of commitments to their organizations. So that, again, in terms of knowing your customers, knowing your neighbors, as we call them, that makes all the difference in the world. I mean, they really cared about who they were helping. And I think those things, just a number of things, but I feel like there were lessons from Bert and Claude that just know your neighbors, do the right thing by them, take care of your people. And we just really tried to lean in on those areas, and just try to, I guess, exploit our differences. And I think it paid off.
Now, at a certain point, you made a big change where you added an independent board.
Yeah.
When did you do that, and why did you do it, and why was that so important?
Yeah. So 12 years ago, and I tell everybody in these kinds of meetings, best thing we ever did. Truly the best thing we ever did, for a number of reasons. But I will also tell you that I understand how scary that can be, and all the reasons why you may contemplate we're not ready for that, or we don't need that. We spent a number of years talking about it first. We were working with Kellogg in Chicago at Northwestern. For many years, heard about independent boards and important boards, and we thought, you're going to bring somebody in from the outside who doesn't know your business. We were very private, particularly from Bert and Claude days, and so to bring somebody in from the outside and share all your financials, and they don't know our business, whatever. I get all the arguments because we made them ourselves. When we finally got to the point where we need outside expertise, we need guidance, we want to grow, and we need to know how to professionalize our organization, even though we thought we were pretty professional back then. So my brother and I got to the point at the same time that we needed to do this. Then we had to bring along our internal board, that folks that had worked with us forever, who really didn't understand why we needed an outside board. It took about a year, honestly, of them kind of working with an outside consultant to say, these are the advantages, this is how you think about this. We had them help us interview, and we decided we were going to go for 3 independents all at the same time. We weren't going to start until we had all 3. And we went through, as it turned out, 2 rounds of interviews. We didn't find everybody that we needed the first time. We just said, would you wait? Because we're not sure that at the end of the day, we're still going to want you if it's not the right fit with all 3. And she was fabulous. She said, yep, of course. So we did another round of interviews, found 2 more amazing people, and then started our independent board 12 years ago. And it's been a godsend to the organization. And then 2 years later, when my brother retired and left the organization, particularly helpful to me as a new CEO. Very respectful of our organization. You got to find the right people, right? And you'll just know if they're the right people. But very respectful of our organization, but kept nudging us, kept moving the bar higher and higher. Still do that. And I love having them as counsel. And just, it helps in the organization as well. I mean, why do you need independents to come tell you you own the business? It's like, well, they have a broader perspective. They have great resources that they've helped us with, and they can challenge our thinking, and that is their job to do. So it's kind of helpful to have that little wedge as well, saying, oh, well, no, we got to run it past the board when you need to do that. So anyways, I can't recommend it more strongly. It was really important for us.
So at the point that your brother was ready to step aside, why did that come about, and how did it go transitioning to you being the CEO?
Yeah, so my brother's 8 years older than I am. So I think honestly, he was burnt out, and he was at a point like, I'm ready to hang it up. So we had been through this, as you've just heard. So we didn't go to an outside evaluation process. We basically said, we went to our attorney and our CFO at the time, and they agreed that they would try to come up with a number for us. Now, when they sat down with us to share the number, and again, if we didn't agree, we'd go back to the drawing board and start some other process, but we were hoping not to spend the money and the time and the effort and the anguish to have to go through that. And I assumed we would have a range. I don't know, just kind of assumed. And our CFO came in and kind of slid a number across the table to the 2 of us, and it was one number. Not what I expected. I thought there'd be a range. And he said, look, here's the 3 different ways that I came to this same number. But at the end of the day, you're going to get in a room. The 2 of you are going to decide what the number is. So if there's any questions you need me to answer, but you go work it out. And within about a month, we came to agreement, as it turned out, on that very same number. So I really appreciate the approach he took, because you're right off the bat, you're already bantering about here or there, and it's like, here's the number, and then we kind of went around and got right back to that number. So it didn't take us long to come to agreement. I think he told me in January, and we made the transition in April, so it was fast. But I think mostly he was ready. He was done, he was burnt out, he'd been in the business a long time, and I felt like he and I had before that there was still much more runway. I still wanted to run the business and grow. So it worked out again. Once again, we all got what we wanted. So I'm really fortunate that happened.
And so you were CEO for 10 years.
Yes.
How do you feel that went? Did you enjoy that role?
I loved it. I'd been in the business 30 years at that point, but I learned so much at that point. Now, maybe that's not a surprise, but to feel like you know your business well and know your people, but One, it is different because it's just you, right? And I did kind of miss, frankly, having somebody else to bounce those ideas off of. But I also was always the middleman, so to speak, for when we had the larger family. With my brother, I was always the negotiator trying to bring everybody. And when I finally realized I didn't have to do that anymore, now I had my board to work with, but I could make the decision. That sounds silly, but it took me a while to really realize, ultimately, it's your decision. And that was sort of empowering. It wasn't scary at that point. It should have been, I guess. But so that was great. I enjoyed it, but I learned so much. I don't even know how to explain. But again, being able to, so I'll tell you the first year, I call it my rediscovery. I went back to decisions that we'd made, big decisions, like we own all our real estate today, always have. That's how Bert and Claude started. That's how we'd always done it. But most retail, that's not how it's done, right? They're leased, right? You don't make those big capital investments. And then when business isn't great, you can pull up stakes and move. Makes a lot of sense, except that's not philosophically how we've looked at it. We make a commitment to a community and we are all in. Never left a community in all these years. But maybe if I wanted to grow, I need to entertain, maybe we should be sale leasebacks. Maybe we should structure ourselves differently. So I had, topics like that I had our attorneys and a couple key people and our CFO kind of do, sessions with me on, all right, let's go back through and see how this really works, and are things different enough that I should be thinking differently, and sort of allowed myself to reaffirm that, and I guarantee you every single one of those key things, I felt really strongly after I went through that, like, no, we're still doing the right thing. I want to stay the course. But I felt like I owed it to myself to make sure at that point, like, just because we've always done it this way, is that the right thing? So I kind of had that year of discovery, sort of rediscovery, that made me even more solid on this has worked all these years. It still makes sense to who we are today. And that foundational kind of work was really reaffirming to me. So at that point, it was run. And then I had to build my own team. Got to, I guess, depending on how you see that. I mean, there's a lot of dear long-term people in our organization that I grew up with that were either getting ready to retire or, frankly, the business had grown beyond where they were. So we had to have some hard conversations and do that in a respectful, graceful way that we all felt comfortable with. And sometimes they just took a lesser role. Some retired. Some were ready to retire. They just wanted to make sure I was okay before they left. And I got to build my own leadership team, which was amazing because for the first time I could say, what should we have, versus what we have. And again, very respectful of the people that got us where we were. I mean, they were dear friends, and I really appreciate all that they did for us. But that's my job, was right, to make sure that we had the right people that could take us to the next level. And I learned a lot, particularly hiring CFOs. That was the toughest one. I went through a couple until I found the right one. But that's okay, you don't get every one of them right, I guess. But for the most part, I built an amazing team that was terrific, really, and I learned a lot from them.
So after 10 years as CEO last year, you stepped aside. Why don't you talk about why you did that and how you kind of prepared for it, but also you handed the baton to a non-family member CEO. For the first time, a non-family member is now in charge of Blain's Farm and Fleet. So I want to talk about what a big deal that was and how you handled that. So walk us through that handoff.
The thinking.
And that decision to even begin it.
Yeah, okay. Well, you've already heard in my vow that I was not going to leave my kids and our business in the position of not having a successor in place and not having a plan. I also wanted plenty of time for that in case I didn't find the right person or in case, it just took longer. I didn't have a specific time frame in mind. I was kind of hoping 4 or 5 years, but it would be what it would be. So we went to an outside firm, did a search, ended up hiring Mark, who's here today. Mark, wave, where are you? Somewhere over there. There he is. Amazing guy. So we found somebody, but it wasn't clear, and we made no commitment to each other that you're going to get this job. We're going to start down a process, right? So we came in overseeing our store operations, quickly took over our automotive service, various areas, e-com, and other pieces of our operations. And we, to his credit, almost every Saturday for 5 years, we would have additional meetings. So, of course, that was during COVID. So it started off, early on, like we could be in a coffee shop, but then it was, we'll just do it virtually now. And those times, so we'd meet during the week, just regular course of business, talking about, what he was seeing, what he was thinking. But then on the weekends was more culture and more, tell me how this works. Is this true you said? There was a lot of those, and I'm like, I said what? There was a lot of those fun stories, like, no, or yes, in this context. So, things he was getting played back to him, he could bounce off me. But I really appreciate, it started out as an hour, oftentimes there were 2 or 3 hours, and in almost every Saturday. So it allowed us to have sort of a separate kind of conversation where we could continue to get more comfortable with each other, why we did things the way that we did, how he thought about things, why I thought the way that I did about things. And that, I really, really value that experience. I mean, there was the business meetings during the week about what we're doing in the moment, but this gave us time to really reflect on where we were, how did we think about things, where were we going, how were we aligned. Super helpful to me, and I think he would tell you the same thing. So at the 4-year mark, after he'd taken on a lot of additional responsibility, Mark became our president. And the great thing in the organization was no one was surprised, right? They're like, well, of course it's Mark, right? So that was great, check, right? Everybody's, and we worked hard, we traveled together, all the stores, lots of events. I wanted everybody to see me with Mark. I wanted, to introduce him, vendors. We spent a lot of time connecting with those partnerships that I talked about early on. I wanted to make sure they knew I was comfortable with him, and then they could start to get to know him, and he could know who was really important to the business. So again, we had the luxury of time to do that over those 4 years, and then he became president. And then at that point, I was like, okay, I'm almost there. I mean, part of it was me being ready, and while I was measuring, was he ready? Because are you ever really ready? It's a big job. It was more about also me. Can I really do this when this is what you've done your whole life? So then it was about 6-8 months after he became president, we told our executive leadership team that we were in a transition in about another 7 months or so. So they knew for a while. And again, they were not surprised that it was Mark. They were happy it was Mark. They had worked closely with him. They had seen, the handwriting on the wall. I think they were surprised that I was really going to go. I don't think anybody really thought I was actually going to go. I wasn't sure if I was really going to go at that point. But they were not at all concerned. They were happy it was Mark. They were comfortable with Mark. So by the time we started to tell the whole organization, which was June last year, actually that's a year ago. Wow. Same thing. They were not surprised that Mark was the guy, and they were very comfortable with him. And in that meantime, I have 2 daughters. The younger one had actually joined the organization right out of school. It was during COVID. That was not the plan. She was supposed to go out, work out, and that wasn't happening at that point, so she came right into the organization. And then my other daughter had just recently joined. So it was a lovely, one, I'm thrilled. I never really thought that was actually going to happen. Thrilled to have them both in the organization, but also it was good for the whole organization to say, all right, you have a non-family member now leading the company. That's never happened at that point in 69 years. What does that mean? Is the family going to step away? Whoever knows what everybody might have been thinking, but they also knew that both my daughters were in the business. And they knew my kids. My kids grew up in the business. So that gave them great comfort, I think, to say there's still family there. I chose executive chair role rather than chairman, because I wanted to be more accessible to Mark on a more regular basis. I wanted people to see me around, but learn how not to meddle in the day-to-day stuff. And so I think that helped people, the whole organization, make that transition with us. That, okay, it's not a family member, but the family's still there, and we spoke loudly about it is our intention to keep this family-owned business, and Mark is absolutely the right guy to help us lead this, into the future. So it was a well thought out, although we didn't have a specific timeline. It worked out to be about 5 years. And I think that was enough time. And at some point, people said this to me. I'm like, how are you going to know when you're ready to retire? And people just say, well, you'll just know. And I'm like, that's a lame answer, right? I will tell you the same thing. I just felt like suddenly I knew. Like, I knew I was ready for something else. I knew Mark was ready. I knew the organization needed to move on. Last thing I wanted to do was, slow up that. I didn't want to frustrate Mark. He needed to know, that this was for real, and he had this opportunity, and so I did just kind of know. So we were lucky, but we worked hard at getting there. It wasn't hard work. It was a lot of time that we really enjoyed together. So here I am, a year later.
Do you have a next succession step with your daughters? How do you see that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's an obvious question. So when my kids were growing up, because of my experience, people would always say, well, assume you're going to run the business someday. And well, first they assumed I was coming into the business, which I wasn't initially. So I know how much pressure that puts on you, and my husband and I never wanted to put that pressure on the girls, saying, look, it's going to be your choice. You make this choice to come back to the family business, and yeah, you could leave, but it would be really difficult. So when you come, you are all in, and I want you to know that you want to do this, right? So with that in mind, as I said, our first daughter came in. The second one had always said she was never coming back. She just said, I love the business. I want to do everything I can to support the business, be a good steward, but I'm not going to work in the business. I said, great. So she went off for another 12 years and worked outside. And then came to a point where she decided, I know I said I didn't want to come back. How would you feel about me coming back? And I'm like, we would love it. And she asked me straight up, where do you see me? I'm like, I can tell you I've never seen you anywhere because I listen to you. And then I said, it's going to be Mark's decision. So Mark is the one who actually decided where Nicole, our oldest daughter, who's just been back a year and a quarter, that she would go to work in our PMO office. It was his suggestion. It was a great suggestion because she gets great exposure across. So as far as answering your question, there's a lot of people that, well, is next one of the girls or whatnot, and I would say that's not clear in my mind. I don't think I would ever want to put that pressure on them. They have to know that they would want to take that role on, and they have to be good enough. And honestly, I told them that their whole life. Maybe that's a cruel thing to say. I tried to say it kindly. But there's 5,500 families and our vendors and everybody else who depend on the things that we do. We have to do it right. Yeah, you get to screw up occasionally, but big decisions. You have to be all in, and there's lots of great people to help you develop and help you get there if that's what you want to do, but you've got to be good enough to do it. And so it's still sort of the answer is like, if you want it, I know Mark is, great about helping them develop, but it's going to come from, their desire and their abilities and where the company is at that time. And we've talked since they were young that this would always happen because there was going to be too much of a gap between me and my kids and nobody else in the family. That we would always have an outside non-family leader, and that we may do that forever. I mean, who knows? Or maybe at some point, maybe there'll be a couple, and then one of them will want to step in. So we've tried not to put that pressure on them. They put a lot of pressure on themselves, but if it happens, it'll be because it's the right thing for them and for the business. It's got to be both. So I don't know, and hopefully I'm around to watch that happen, but that'll be their call, and if not, we'll have, we've proven we can find excellent talent on the outside who want to be part of this culture, who want to support a family organization, and if we need to keep doing that, that's what we'll do.
Well, with that, we're out of time. So thank you, Jane, for sharing your journey. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.